Hello, this is Karen Burroughs Hannsberry. I'm the author of Film Noir, The Bad Girls of Film, and Bad Boys, the Actor of Film Noir, as well as the editor of the bi-monthly film noir newsletter, The Dark Pages. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about The Emperor Jones, starring Paul Robeson. As you see on the screen, the film was based on the play of the same name by Eugene O'Neill, which was written in 1920. O'Neill's one-act play had 8 scenes and 4 speaking parts and took place entirely on an island in the West Indies. That setting is represented by what you hear and see behind the opening credits. But the screenplay for the movie expands on O'Neill's play by fleshing out the backstory of the main character, Brutus Jones, and adding more characters and scenes. The first of these added scenes will be coming up in just a moment, as the film does a lap dissolve from the natives performing this tribal dance to the service at a Southern Baptist church. Beginning in a small town in the South, the screen adaptation of O'Neill's work stretches over several years, journeys to a number of locations from Harlem, New York to Savannah, Georgia, and depicts Brutus in a variety of situations and circumstances. Just to give you a brief overview, the screenplay was adapted from O'Neill's play by DuBose Heyward, with assistance from the director of the film, Dudley Murphy. It was produced by 2 relative novices in the film industry, John Krimsky and Gifford Cochran, and it was released by United Artists. Now, I want to point out here that O'Neill's play contains liberal mentions of what I'm going to be referring to as the N-word, as did the original version of the film and the version you see here. The film ended up going through a number of cuts, but after it was selected in 1999 for the National Film Registry, the Library of Congress received a $200,000 grant to restore the film through the Treasures from the American Film Archives project. I'll be talking more later about the specific scenes that were cut and the ones that were restored, but the film that you see on this DVD release is as close as possible to the original version released in September 1933. Now, in this opening scene, we see that the church pastor is devoting the closing prayer of the service to one of the church's members, Brutus Jones, who's about to leave town to enter a new phase of his life. During this prayer, the minister creates an interesting image of Brutus. He mentions the Bible story of the prodigal son, about a young man who demands his inheritance from his father, leaves home, and then spends all of his money on a lavish lifestyle in a faraway land. But the minister says that Brutus is not like the prodigal son, and that Brutus is not puffed up or vainglorious, which refers to a person who's overly pleased or excessively proud of their achievements. Contained in this prayer, then, is actually a bit of foreshadowing, because as we soon discover, this is really a pretty accurate description of exactly what Brutus is and does. And speaking of Brutus, here he is, played by our star of the film, Paul Robeson. I'll get into Robeson's life and career in a bit, but I do want you to remember 2 things about this scene. When we first see Brutus, he's admiring himself in the mirror, and he's wearing the uniform for his new job as a Pullman porter. More on these later. First, though, I want to focus on the character sitting with Brutus on the bed. This is his girlfriend, Dolly. She's played by Ruby Elsie, who was known more for her singing than her acting. In fact, she only appeared in 5 movies, and The Emperor Jones was her first. She was a classically trained soprano who sang in 4 languages at venues ranging from the Hollywood Bowl to the White House. Ruby was born in Pontotoc, Mississippi in 1908, and she was taught Negro spirituals by her grandmother, who was born a slave. She sang in public for the first time in church, and she decided from that time on that she wanted to be a performer. She attended Russ College in Mississippi and Ohio State University, and she earned 2 graduate degrees from the Juilliard School of Music. She was best known for playing the role of Serena in the original Broadway production of Porgy and Bess, which she would play more than 800 times over a span of almost 10 years, beginning in 1935. Her most popular song in this musical was My Man's Gone Now, which was co-written by DuBose Heyward, the screenwriter for Emperor Jones. To give you an idea of Ruby's talent, one of her many reviews said that she was gifted with a voice of crystalline timbre, which she uses in excellent style, and that she sang in a tone of exquisite limpidness. In addition to The Emperor Jones, Ruby's films included Way Down South, which was written by actor Clarence Muse and writer Langston Hughes, making them the first Black men to write a screenplay for a mainstream Hollywood movie. Her last movie was Birth of the Blues in 1941, starring Bing Crosby and Mary Martin, which gave Ruby her biggest role. Sadly, only a few years later, she would die after having an operation to remove a benign tumor. She was just 35 years old. Now here we see that Brutus and Dolly have arrived at the church, where Brutus is getting a big send-off from the members of the congregation. In just a few moments, we'll hear Robeson sing the first of several songs in the film. In Eugene O'Neill's play, there was no singing, but the screenplay was written to accommodate Robeson's vocal ability in scenes throughout the film. The vocal arrangements in the movie were by John Rosamund Johnson, who was best known for writing the melody to Lift Every Voice and Sing. His older brother, James Weldon Johnson, wrote the lyrics, and the song would later be adopted by the NAACP as the Negro National Anthem. John studied at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, and he sang in several Broadway productions, including Porgy and Bess with Ruby Elsie and Mamba's Daughters with Freddie Washington, who we'll see a little later in the film. And speaking of Ruby Elsie, she worked for a time as Johnson's assistant, and she was cast as Dolly in the film after she helped him to lead the singing in the church scenes. Around 1900, when he was in his early 20s, Johnson teamed up with singer-songwriter Bob Cole, and the two wrote more than 200 songs, including Under the Bamboo Tree. The song was a big hit, and if you've seen the 1944 movie Meet Me in St. Louis, you might remember the song being performed by Judy Garland and Margaret O'Brien. The singers in this scene were members of the Hall Johnson Choir, which was once called the only choir in the history of American cinema to become a movie star. Hall Johnson was a composer and arranger of Black spiritual music, and he founded the choir in 1925. The group started out performing in Broadway productions, and Johnson would later conduct the choir in more than 30 shorts and feature films, including Meet John Doe, The Road to Zanzibar, Cabin in the Sky, and 2 Disney movies, Dumbo and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, as we see Brutus saying goodbye to Dolly and heading off to work on the railroad as a Pullman porter, I want you to check out this wad of money that Brutus gives to Dolly. It's so much money that it even makes her a bit wary, and she questions if he's coming back. It turns out that she was right to wonder. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Brutus's new job was working as a Pullman porter. These porters worked on trains in America for 100 years, starting in the late 1860s, after industrialist George Pullman designed and manufactured the Pullman sleeper car. The cars were staffed by Black men who became known as Pullman porters. Initially, George Pullman hired former slaves. The porters had numerous duties, including carrying luggage, setting up the sleeping berths, shining shoes, and performing any other services requested by passengers. The job was considered prestigious in the Black community, but the hours were long and porters depended on tips for most of their income. Also, it was common for passengers to call all porters by the name of George, which was a throwback to when slaves were given the names of their owners, so it was a really demeaning insinuation that the porters were servants of George Pullman. The practice of calling porters George was so common that in 1916, white Chicago businessman George Delaney Jr. founded the Society for the Prevention of Calling Sleeping Car Porters George, or SPCS-CPG. Delaney came up with the idea as a joke, but the group eventually claimed to have more than 30,000 members. A far more serious and impactful organization was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, founded in 1925. It was the first predominantly Black labor union and eventually resulted in higher wages, shorter working hours, and better job security for the porters. And they were given badges that identified their real names. Now, in this scene, we'll see 2 of the film's key characters, Jeff and Undine. But before I talk about them, I want to call your attention to an uncredited performance coming up in just a few moments. Let's take a look.
South Carolina. Tell him, Mr. Jones. Don't be discreet. Cheers, man. Oh, come here, Marcella. Meet Mr. Jones. This is Marcella Jones.
Hello, big boy.
The character who's being introduced to Brutus is played by the actress who would later become famous as comedian Moms Mabley. She was born Loretta Mary Aiken in 1894, and she began her career in vaudeville, gaining popularity as Jackie Mabley on the Chitlin Circuit, which was a collection of venues that catered to black performers and audiences. She was one of the first openly gay comedians, and during the 1920s and 30s, she frequently dressed as you see her in the film. She adopted the name Moms in the 1950s and took on the persona of a toothless older woman, performing in a bucket hat and brightly colored housecoat. She went on to play venues like Carnegie Hall and on television shows including The Smothers Brothers, The Ed Sullivan Show, and The Pearl Bailey Show. Part of her act focused on her preference for young, handsome men. She would say that there was nothing an old man could do for her but bring her a message from a young one. She also used her non-threatening persona to talk about serious topics like the war, segregation, racism, and civil rights. After a career that spanned 6 decades, she died of heart failure in 1975. Now I want to talk a little bit here about the actress with Paul Robeson. Her name is Fredi Washington, and she plays Undine. She was only in 4 feature-length movies, released between 1933 and 1937, but she's still remembered by film fans today for the original screen version of Fannie Hurst's best-selling novel Imitation of Life, which was released in 1934. In that film, she was Piola, a light-skinned black woman who rejects her mother, played by Louise Beavers, and tries to pass for white. Unfortunately, in real life, Fredi's complexion restricted the parts she was able to get on screen. She was too light to play the maids, cooks, and other servant roles that most black actresses were cast in, and the environment in Hollywood at that time prevented her from being cast in romantic parts opposite white actors. And while I'm on the subject of her skin color, I want you to pay special notice to the appearance of her face. I'm going to talk more about that later. Fredi was born Frederica Carolyn Washington in Savannah in 1903. She started her career as a chorus girl and made her Broadway debut in 1921 in the cast of Shuffle Along, which was the first Broadway musical with an all-black cast, playwright, composer, and lyricist. She later toured Europe with dancer Al Moore and was back on Broadway in 1926 in the play Black Boy, where she used the name Edith Warren. Incidentally, the star of Black Boy was Paul Robeson. She had her first speaking part on the big screen in a 1929 musical short called Black and Tan, which starred Duke Ellington and was written and directed by Dudley Murphy, a few years before he would direct The Emperor Jones. More on Murphy in a bit. After Imitation of Life, Fredi was in 2 other feature films, both dealing with themes of race. In the 1936 film Uwanga, she is a black plantation owner who is in love with a white man and uses voodoo to get revenge on him when he rejects her for a white woman. And the following year, in 1 Mile from Heaven, starring Claire Trevor, she plays a light-skinned black woman who's claiming to be the mother of a white baby. There were newspaper reports that she would star opposite boxer Joe Louis in the 1938 film Spirit of Youth, but she ended up turning down the part because she couldn't reach an agreement with producers on her salary. She never appeared in another feature film. Around this time, Fredi co-founded the Negro Actors Guild of America, along with several others including Paul Robeson and Ethel Waters. The mission of the organization was to advocate for better roles for black performers and speak out against stereotyping. Beginning in the 1940s, Fredi spent much of her energy on writing for The People's Voice, a weekly newspaper founded by minister-turned-politician Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who at that time was married to Fredi's sister, Isabel. She used her position at the paper to write more than 200 articles on a variety of topics, including racism and sexism in the media and the treatment of black soldiers during World War II. She also became involved with the NAACP and causes that included anti-lynching efforts and environmental issues. She was once quoted as saying, "I am an American citizen, and by God, we all have inalienable rights. And whenever and wherever those rights are tampered with, there is nothing left to do but fight. And I fight." Now here we see another shot of Brutus admiring himself in a mirror, as he did in the scene where we first met him. Continue to keep these shots in mind. But before I go any further, I want to tell you a little about the director of the film, Dudley Murphy, which may not be a name you've heard before, and I can understand why. He directed fewer than 30 productions, more than half of those were shorts, and most of his films are all but forgotten today. On the other hand, 3 of his productions have been selected for the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress: St. Louis Blues and Black and Tan from 1929, and The Emperor Jones. Murphy was born in Winchester, Massachusetts in 1897. He studied electrical engineering in college, and he flew bombing missions during World War I, but after the war he found that he was no longer interested in engineering. Fortunately, he encountered a fellow pilot who had become an assistant casting director at Paramount. He told Murphy he could find work as an extra for $10 a day, and Murphy got a job on Male and Female, a 1919 Gloria Swanson film directed by Cecil B. DeMille. Once he got that taste of the film industry, he never looked back. Just a little more than a year after he got his first motion picture job as an extra, he directed his first film, a 9-minute short called Soul of the Cypress. The critic for the New York Times called it unusually interesting, and a trade paper called With's Daily praised the film's composition, tone, and lighting. It was a promising start for Murphy. Now I'm going to stop here for a moment to call your attention to the upcoming scene, which takes place in a nightclub. It starts with a shot of a waiter spinning his tray, which is something that Murphy saw waiters doing when he visited a nightclub in Harlem with a friend. He liked it so much that he incorporated it in St. Louis Blues and Black and Tan before using it again here. Coming up in a few seconds is future star Harold Nicholas, who found fame as a dancer along with his older brother Heyward. Here, Harold is 12 years old. He was born in Philadelphia in 1921, and he was given his name by his brother, who idolized silent comedian Harold Lloyd. As a young boy, Heyward loved watching the dancers at the vaudeville shows where his parents worked as musicians. He started imitating them, and when he was able, Harold began imitating his brother. The two started dancing in local theaters and performed at Harlem's Cotton Club in 1932. Also that year, they first appeared on screen in a musical short called Pie Pie Blackbird, and they debuted on Broadway in the Ziegfeld Follies of 1936 in a show that included Josephine Baker, Fanny Brice, and Bob Hope. They would go on to appear in many films and Broadway productions and were considered to be one of the greatest dance teams in the history of entertainment. As you now see on screen, Undine has arrived at the nightclub and she finds Brutus with another woman. The two ladies are about to get into a scuffle, and I'd like you to check out the music. You hear a slow dance number at first, but after the women get into it, the band changes to an upbeat tune called Casa Loma Stomp. It's a small moment in the film, but it's just so funny to me that the band plays this soundtrack to accompany the fight, like it's part of the night's entertainment. Let's listen.
What do you mean?
I mean, when I get finished with Belle, he ain't gonna have much left to love.
It's traveling light.
By the way, according to most accounts, jazz singer Billie Holiday and actor Lorenzo Tucker, known as the Black Valentino, both appeared as extras at that nightclub scene. Also listed as an extra in the scene was football player and coach Fritz Pollard, who served as a casting assistant as well as Robeson's dresser on the film. And I can't tell you how many times I've watched that scene trying to spot all three, but I haven't seen them yet. Also, according to several accounts, director Dudley Murphy served alcohol to the extras in that scene in an effort to create an air of authenticity. He'd done something similar in his short St. Louis Blues, but in St. Louis Blues, the extras were given beer, and Murphy gave hard liquor to the extras in The Emperor Jones. The result was a completely wasted day of shooting. Now, since this scene shows a crucial incident involving Brutus's friend Jeff here, I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about Frank H. Wilson, the actor who plays him. Wilson was a real Renaissance man. He wasn't just an actor, he was also a playwright, director, and singer. And while he was discovering these creative abilities, he showed his practical side by working for almost 10 years as a mail carrier in Manhattan, where he was born. In 1914, Wilson started writing and performing in one-act plays in Harlem. One of his plays won a prize from Opportunity magazine for the best play of 1926. He made his Broadway debut in 1924 in Eugene O'Neill's play All God's Children Got Wings, which starred Paul Robeson. He also originated the title role in the 1927 Broadway production of Porgy. He would eventually play Porgy more than 800 times, including in London in a command performance before King George V. In his role as Moses in the 1935 Broadway revival of The Green Pastures, Wilson was singled out by one critic who said that he gave the inspiring performance everyone who knows him expected. The following year, Wilson wrote, co-directed, and appeared in Walk Together Chillin' for the Negro Theater Unit of the Federal Theater Project. And in 1939, he was in the hit Broadway production of Kiss the Boys Goodbye, directed by Antoinette Perry, who was the namesake for Broadway's Tony Award. Wilson was mainly a stage actor, but he was also in several feature films. He made his big screen debut in The Girl from Chicago, directed in 1932 by pioneering black director Oscar Micheaux. He starred in the 1939 film Paradise in Harlem, which he co-wrote. And in 1943, he had a small part in Watch on the Rhine, starring Bette Davis and Paul Lucas, in the role he had played in the Broadway production of the same name. Also on Broadway, he was in several productions that would later be made into feature films, including South Pacific, which was Ruby Dee's Broadway debut, Anna Lucasta, in a cast that included Sidney Poitier and Rosetta Lenoir, who you might remember as Mother Winslow on TV's Family Matters, and The Big Knife, which starred John Garfield and Nancy Kelly, who was best known for playing the mother in the 1956 movie The Bad Seed. Wilson's last Broadway performance came in 1953 in Take a Giant Step, in a cast that included Lou Gossett Jr. and Helen Martin, who would become a familiar face on TV shows like 227 and Good Times. Also in that cast was Estelle Evans, who played Gregory Peck's housekeeper in To Kill a Mockingbird and who was the real-life sister of actress Esther Rolle. Now getting back to the action on screen, we see that Jeff is about to meet an untimely end at the hands of Brutus Jones, and this becomes a significant turning point in Brutus's life. Even though he kills Jeff in self-defense, this doesn't prevent him from ending up on the chain gang, which we'll see shortly. But let's take a look at how we got to this point. When we were first introduced to Brutus, before he sets out for his job as Pullman porter, he's presented as a well-liked, well-respected, church-going man with a steady, solid relationship with his girlfriend. But it really doesn't take long for us to start seeing cracks in this upstanding image. On his job with the railroad, his friend Jeff, who, for all we know, could have gotten Brutus the job, gives him advice on how to get bigger tips from the passengers, and he rewards Jeff by not only stealing his girlfriend from right under his nose, but also referring to his friend behind his back as a two-bit porter. When he tells Undine about his newfound fortune, Brutus makes up a tall tale about giving valuable advice on the train to a corporation president and the president making him his partner. And when Undine laughs at this account, he dumps her and then adds insult to injury by tossing a few bills in her direction, which she isn't too proud to take, by the way, but that's another story. And then there's the callous way he skips out on his new girl after she's attacked by Undine in the nightclub. He doesn't even try to help her or break up the fight. He just grabs his hat and hits the bricks. And now he's not only taken one life, but he's about to take another. Now there are some who might question how there could be such a drastic change in Brutus's personality from our first impression of him, but I understand it perfectly. My mother always said that people don't change. They just get the opportunity to show you who they really are. And as the film goes on, Brutus continues to demonstrate the truth of this. In fact, in a few minutes, he'll display one of the only real acts of integrity that we'll see from him during the entire film, when he refuses the guard's order to beat a fellow prisoner. Let's wait for that scene as we listen to Paul Robeson singing Waterboy here.
Water me from the lime rock branch, water I cannot drink. You deck of diamonds, yes, you deck of diamonds. Well, I know you're
Come here, Jones. Open it up. Open it up. Asleep, eh? Well, I'll learn him how to run away. Wake him up.
Well, if I lay my hands on that boy, the Lord will strike me dead.
Won't take orders, eh?
Before I continue, I want to call your attention to the part of the movie coming up next, where the prison guard ends up dead. I'll talk about that a little later, but as we close in on the halfway mark of the movie, I don't want to go any further without starting my discussion about the actor who gave us Brutus Jones, Paul Robeson, who had an amazing life both as a performer and as an activist for civil rights. He was born in Princeton, New Jersey on April 9, 1898, and his father William was born a slave who escaped from his North Carolina plantation when he was 15. According to family legend, William was assisted in his escape by Harriet Tubman via the Underground Railroad. William would go on to graduate from Lincoln University and become the minister of a Presbyterian church. Paul was the youngest of his 5 children. The family later moved to Somerville, New Jersey, where Robeson was involved in acting, singing, and debate in high school, and in 1915 he earned a scholarship to Rutgers University, becoming only the 3rd Black student to attend the school. He was a good student academically and a standout athlete, especially in football. He was named All-American for 2 years in a row, but it's worth noting that it would take almost 80 years for him to be inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. Robeson went on to attend Columbia Law School, and he paid for his education by playing professional football for several teams, including the Milwaukee Badgers. One of his teammates was Fritz Pollard, who, as I mentioned, worked on Emperor Jones. Robeson graduated from Columbia in 1923, but by that time his career plans had turned in another direction. You see, a few years earlier, he'd been encouraged by his then-girlfriend, later his wife, Eslanda, to give acting a try, and he accepted the lead in a small play at the local YWCA. Robeson later said he never planned to become an actor, and he only agreed to take the part to get Eslanda to, quote, quit pestering me. Even though he didn't have any previous experience, though, the local Black newspaper praised his performance as sincere and powerful, and his career took off from there. During the next several years, Robeson was in a series of Broadway productions, including Shuffle Along and Taboo with Margaret Wycherley, who you might know as the mother of James Cagney in his 1949 film White Heat. He also traveled to London to star in Voodoo, which was a revamped version of Taboo. Neither one of these plays was very successful, but Voodoo was memorable for several musical numbers by Robeson, and he was singled out by one reviewer who pointed out, quote, the wonderful singing of that fine-looking Negro in the cast. Now, I'm going to pause in my look at Paul Robeson for a bit, because it's around this point in the film where you start hearing the use of the N-word. So let's get into it. First of all, there were exactly 35 mentions of the N-word in Eugene O'Neill's play, beginning in the very first scene, in fact, within the first 2 minutes of dialogue, and the film has almost as many mentions of the word. The Hays office, which was responsible for enforcing the motion picture production code, obviously had no problem with the frequent use of the word, despite the fact that it's extremely offensive to the Black community. And while Black audiences certainly took pride in Robeson's achievement as the star of the film, and initially had a favorable reaction to the movie, the use of the N-word was a huge issue. It didn't take long after the release of the film for objections to start coming from the Black press. A headline in the New York Amsterdam News said, Harlem dislikes N-word in Emperor Jones. A Pittsburgh Courier article stated, compared to this picture, the low comedy of Amos and Andy is positively flattering, and only The Birth of a Nation is worse. And in the Afro-American, J.A. Rogers wrote, nearly all the old stock in trade as crap shooting, gin guzzling, immorality, cutting, killing, fear of ghosts, and other supposed Negro characteristics are dragged in heavier quantities than usual, not to mention the refrain of N-word, 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 which runs through the whole piece from beginning to end. The producers took these grievances to heart. Less than a month after the release of the film, one of the producers sent a telegram to Al Lichtman, then vice president at United Artists, in which he said, "Pursuant to your request, we are eliminating the N-word from all new prints that we'll make on Emperor Jones. We have no intention of offending the Negroes, who were largely instrumental in making the screen version of Emperor Jones one of the greatest pictures of the season." Afterward, there were two separate prints of the Emperor Jones, one that aired in white theaters with the offensive word intact, and one for black theaters with the language cut. The elimination of the N-word did seem to provide some sense of satisfaction. For instance, William Nunn Jr. wrote in the Pittsburgh Courier that the film was one that every man, woman, and child of the Negro race should see, but he encouraged them to view the edited version where, quote, "you can maintain your race pride and self-respect without having to be insulted or offended." Now, back on screen, the character you see entering the room in the white suit is Smithers. He's played by Dudley Diggs, who was once called one of the most beloved actors on the American stage. Born in Dublin, Ireland in 1879, he was a founding member of the Irish National Dramatic Company, and in 1904 he traveled to America to perform at the World Exhibition in St. Louis. After performing in only one play, he was fired from the company, but there are conflicting accounts about the reason why. One source says he was fired after getting into a fight with the stage manager over some anti-Irish elements in one of the plays. But another source says he was fired because he violated the company's policy that prohibited actors from leaving during the theatrical season. Either way, Diggs decided to stay in the U.S., and he worked mainly as a stage manager for the next 10 years, 7 of those for actor George Arliss. He also became one of the co-founders of New York's Theater Guild. In fact, he performed in the Guild's first production in 1919. He would go on to appear in more than 3,500 performances and direct several productions for the Guild before he took his talents to the big screen in 1929 at the age of 50. Some of his best-known roles were the chief detective in The Invisible Man in 1933, starring Claude Rains, and Bacchus, the ill-fated surgeon in Mutiny on the Bounty with Charles Laughton and Clark Gable in 1935. He was also in the original Maltese Falcon with Ricardo Cortez, where he played Caspar Gutman, the part Sidney Greenstreet played in the Humphrey Bogart remake. My favorite Dudley Diggs movies are 2 pre-code films, The Strange Case of Clara Dean and The Mayor from Hell. In both of these, Diggs plays a pretty despicable character, and he does a great job. Between screen roles, Diggs returned to the stage in plays like Candida and The Iceman Cometh, written by Eugene O'Neill. About his performance in The Iceman Cometh, one critic wrote, "To anyone who loves acting, Dudley Diggs' performance as the tottering and irascible saloon proprietor is worth particular cherishing." This role would be the last of Diggs' career, and he would continue playing it until 1947, when he died at the age of 68. Now I'm going to take some time here to circle back to Paul Robeson's life and career. In the early 1920s, he joined the Provincetown Players, a semi-professional theater company whose membership included Eugene O'Neill. Robeson played the lead in O'Neill's production of All God's Children Got Wings, and he was then cast in the title role of the Emperor Jones for a 1924 revival in New York. He went on to play the same role when the production opened in London. But Robeson wasn't the first to star in the stage version of The Emperor Jones. When the play opened in November 1920, the title role was played by Charles Gilpin, who was one of the best-known actors of his day. Although Gilpin played the role both on Broadway and on tour, Eugene O'Neill wasn't happy when he learned that Gilpin had made changes to his part, replacing the N-word with Negro or colored man. According to several O'Neill biographers, O'Neill threatened to, quote, beat the hell out of Gilpin if he continued to change the lines, and he ended up replacing him with Robeson. In a letter to another member of the Provincetown Players, O'Neill called Robeson a fine man with real brains who won't lose his head if he makes a hit. Sadly, Gilpin never appeared on Broadway again, and he struggled with alcohol, dying a few years later at the age of 51. Robeson, meanwhile, returned to London in 1928 to appear in the musical Showboat, performing the song that would become most associated with him, Old Man River. Over the years, though, as Robeson became more involved in the struggle for civil rights, he modified the words to the song. Originally, it started out with several lines containing the N-word, which Robeson stopped singing altogether. And there was a line that says, "I'm tired of living and scared of dying," and Robeson changed this to, "I must keep fighting until I'm dying." Now, I'm going to interrupt myself here for just a few minutes to talk about the next two scenes and how they show one of Brutus's most outstanding personality traits, which was using his intelligence to manipulate situations to his own benefit. Earlier in the movie, when Brutus was working as a Pullman porter, we saw him eavesdropping on the president of a corporation and very subtly blackmailing him in order to get in on a crooked investment deal. In fact, if you weren't paying close attention, you may not have even realized what Brutus was doing. That's how smooth he is. And here, he pulls off a similar smooth operation to get Smithers to make him his partner. He does it with a smile and a jovial manner and few words, but he says just enough so that Smithers is compelled to do exactly what Brutus wants him to do. You can tell by the look on Smithers' face at the end of this scene that he doesn't even really know what just happened. And in the next scene, where Brutus and Smithers present their bill to the king, you'll hear Smithers warn Brutus that he has to be diplomatic, but Brutus doesn't need or heed his advice. He first shows that he's even more blatantly unethical than Smithers when it comes to price gouging, and then, having put blanks in the gun belonging to one of the king's guards, he cons the natives into thinking he could only be killed by a silver bullet. And this, of course, leads to his pulling off his most successful manipulation yet. As he'll tell Smithers, for the little stealing, they get you in jail sooner or later. For the big stealing, they make you emperor and put you in the Hall of Fame. Now, getting back to Robeson, he made his big screen debut in 1925 in Body and Soul, directed by Oscar Micheaux, but he would only appear in 11 full-length films during his career. Beginning in 1935, he made several films in England, but although he had hoped to use these movies to present black characters in a favorable light, this usually isn't what happened. According to cinema scholar Clyde Taylor, the plots of Robeson's films in England, quote, always have possibilities of exalting some of the things he cared about, and yet stereotypes always creep back in and snatch the intention that he had in the beginning. And Robeson himself would write that he would finish a part in a movie and come away feeling positive about it, only to see in the finished product that things were changed and distorted. However, he said that this experience made him more conscious politically. In addition to his stage and screen work, Robeson was a popular singer as well. He gave his first formal concert in April 1925, consisting solely of black folk songs and spirituals, which Robeson felt depicted the history and struggle of his people. He would go on to perform these concerts throughout the United States and worldwide over the years, often incorporating folk songs from other countries. He once said he did this to demonstrate that all men are brothers because of their music. Outside of his performing career, Robeson was best known for his passion against injustice. In 1934, he made his first visit to the Soviet Union, where he found that the Constitution stressed equality among all of its citizens. He stated that in Russia, he felt like he was treated like a full human being for the first time. By 1937, he had decided to devote his life to a quest for civil rights, and at a rally he told the audience, "The artist must take sides. He must elect to fight for freedom or for slavery. I have made my choice." During the next decade, Robeson appeared at rallies, conferences, and festivals, performing protest music in several languages and speaking out against racism and in support of labor unions. He refused to perform in segregated theaters, and he protested against Jim Crow laws by joining NAACP picket lines. But in 1949, after he was misquoted in a comment about the Soviet Union at a conference in Paris, he seemed to become persona non grata overnight. A few months later, riots actually broke out near Cortlandt Manor, New York, where he was scheduled to perform in concert. Following this incident, most of his appearances were canceled, and his income dropped from $100,000 to $6,000 a year. He was investigated by the FBI, which bugged his phone, opened his mail, and followed him almost every day. And then in 1950, the federal government revoked Robeson's passport, preventing him from traveling outside the country. 8 years later, after a Supreme Court ruling that a passport couldn't be held for political reasons, Robeson's passport was returned, and he made his final overseas concert tour in 1960. Following years of ill health, he died in 1976 at the age of 77. In a documentary on his life, biographer Lloyd Brown said, "He was a great human being. He was a great artist. He was a great fighter for our people. He was a great fighter for peace. He was a beautiful human being." Now back on screen, if you've noticed the visual style of the film, it's due in part to art director Homan Rossi, who was born in the Netherlands, studied architecture and design at the Royal College of Art in London, and received a degree in architecture from Stanford University. He had a remarkable career. When he was just 24 years old, he designed the interior of the Peace Palace at The Hague, which houses the main judicial body of the United Nations. He later moved to the United States, where he worked in many different areas all over the country. He designed the Netherlands Pavilion at San Francisco's 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. He headed up the design department at the Art Institute of Chicago. He received acclaim for his solo exhibition at the Arden Galleries in New York, and he designed sets in New York for vaudeville, musicals, and stage plays. He just did so much before he even started in the movies. I mean, this isn't even the half of it. In the late 1920s, Rossi signed on with Universal Studios in Hollywood, where he created the sets for the 1931 film Frankenstein and contributed to the designs used in the movies Dracula and Murders in the Rue Morgue. He also won the first Oscar for art direction for the 1930 movie King of Jazz, which was a color musical starring band leader Paul Whiteman. He continued his design work after he left the movies, working for more than a decade as the stage designer at the Paper Mill Playhouse in Millburn, New Jersey. And he made a lasting impact on Broadway in 1949 when he won a competition to design the medallion that's still in use today for the Tony Award. Now, coming up here in just a few seconds is something I want you to make a note of. You'll see Smithers lighting Brutus's cigarette. Let's take a look.
This place smells more like a chain gang dumped in a palace. Say, Smithers, how you likes the contract of doing this dump over?
Now you're talking.
And don't make the mistake of thinking you're dealing any ignorant bush nigger. I gives you an audience tomorrow. And bring along them fashion sheets that I gets last summer. And then I want some mirrors, plenty of them. And remember, Smithers, red's my color. I always had a special taste for red.
There he is looking in the mirror again.
Mr. President. No. King Brutus. No, somehow that don't make enough noise. Smithers, cigarette. Light. Smithers, you has just had an audience with the Emperor Jones.
I'll return to this in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, let's go back to a few earlier scenes and connect some dots. If you'll remember, when we first saw Brutus, he was admiring himself in a mirror. And after making money in that crooked business deal, we again saw him gazing at his reflection. And now that he's made himself emperor, he's hired Smithers to redecorate the palace and fill it with mirrors. And you'll see in an upcoming scene, he literally stops to look at himself every time he passes one of these mirrors. But I think it's clear that there's more to Brutus than just his love for the way he looks. For my money, he exhibits all the signs of a narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, he has an unrealistic sense of superiority, he has a lack of empathy for others, a tendency to use others for selfish reasons, he's arrogant and disdainful. It's all there. It's all there. And while we're discussing Brutus, let me just say, I find him to be an absolutely fascinating character for a number of reasons, not least because he's a mass of contradictions. He has the intelligence and the guts to have gotten where he is, but he's his own worst enemy, and he's directly responsible for his own downfall. He's smart and he's crafty, but he's not as smart as he thinks he is. He's clearly not smart enough to know that you can attract more flies with honey than with vinegar. But from the time he takes over as emperor, he's constantly digging his own grave. Not only that, but he's the epitome of the notion that the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. As we learn later in the film, Brutus hides foods in the jungle, he stashes money in an offshore bank, he even puts a silver bullet in his gun to use if he chooses to end his life. But none of these preparations will make a bit of difference in the end. Brutus thinks he's outsmarted everyone, but ultimately, he's the one who gets outsmarted. Now, as you know, the character of Brutus Jones was the brainchild of Eugene O'Neill, who's yet another person connected with this production who had an incredible life and career. O'Neill was born in 1888 in a New York City hotel room, and incidentally, he also died in a hotel room. His father was stage actor James O'Neill, who played his best-known role, the Count of Monte Cristo, more than 6,000 times during his career. After attending several boarding schools, Eugene O'Neill enrolled in Princeton University, but he was only there for a year. Most accounts say he was kicked out of the school because of bad behavior, but at least one source says he left because he was performing poorly in his classes and simply saw no reason to continue. Either way, he spent the next 6 years racking up a wide range of various experiences. He worked as a seaman on steamer ships. He caught malaria while he was prospecting for gold in Honduras. He lived like a tramp on waterfronts in Buenos Aires and New York. He struggled with alcohol and depression, and he tried to commit suicide. And then in 1912, he got tuberculosis, spending 5 months in a sanatorium in Connecticut. By the way, on screen you'll see here what I referred to earlier, where Brutus just can't help stopping to check himself out at every mirror he passes. At the sanatorium in Connecticut, O'Neill started reading the works of several writers, including Swedish playwright August Strindberg. He said these plays gave him the vision of what modern drama could be and inspired him to write for the theater himself. Now, before I continue with O'Neill, I want you to check out a character coming up. He's the court crier, and he'll be introducing the emperor in just a few seconds. Let's listen.
His Majesty is on the throne.
The court crier is played by Rex Ingram, not to be confused with the Irish director of the same name. This Rex Ingram is perhaps best known for his roles in the 1939 film The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, where he starred as Jim with Mickey Rooney, and The Thief of Baghdad from 1940, where he was a standout as the genie. Ingram made his big screen debut in 1918 after hanging around studios in Hollywood hoping for a chance to get into the movies. He said, "I had many ambitions, most of which concerned raising my people's intellectual and cultural standards. But a man must eat, so when they offered a job as an extra, I took it." The role was a cannibal chief in the silent version of Tarzan of the Apes. After more bit parts and roles in some short-lived Broadway productions, Ingram landed a starring role as God in the 1936 film Green Pastures. During the 1940s, he was seen in a number of popular films, including Talk of the Town with Cary Grant, Cabin in the Sky, and 1001 Nights. Unfortunately, Ingram's climb towards success was cut short in 1948 when he was arrested for violating the Mann Act, which made it a crime to transport girls or women across state lines for immoral purposes. Ingram pleaded guilty and served 10 months in jail. His career never really recovered, but he did get small parts in movies like Elmer Gantry and Hurry Sundown in the 1960s. Ingram died of a heart attack in 1969 at the age of 73. At his funeral, a prayer was offered by actor George Kennedy, and his eulogy was read by James Whitmore. Now, getting back to Eugene O'Neill, he wrote more than 50 plays during his career and won Pulitzer Prizes for 4 of them, Beyond the Horizon, Anna Christie, Strange Interlude, and posthumously A Long Day's Journey into Night, more than any other playwright. O'Neill's play The Emperor Jones, which he originally called The Silver Bullet, was inspired by several factors. First off, he reportedly based Brutus's personality and manner of speaking on a black friend of his. Some sources say he was a bartender at O'Neill's favorite tavern in New London, Connecticut, while others say he was a sailor O'Neill met during his waterfront days. And he was inspired by a Haitian dictator named Vilbrun Guillaume Sam to create Brutus's experiences after he became emperor. Sam was president of Haiti for only a few months in 1915 before he was assassinated by rebels. He had bragged that he could only be killed by a self-inflicted silver bullet. Finally, O'Neill drew on his own hallucinogenic experience in Honduras when he came up with Brutus's visions during his flight during the jungle. As I mentioned earlier, O'Neill's play was adapted by DuBose Heyward, who created the backstory for Brutus. This scene, where Brutus is awakened by Smithers, is around the time that O'Neill's play actually begins. The only difference is that the play has a character of an old native woman, who's the one who tells Smithers that all the servants have run off to the hills. DuBose Heyward was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1885, and he was the author of the novel Porgy. And here's a fun fact. Reportedly, one of his ancestors was Judge Thomas Heyward, Jr., who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. When Heyward was 17, he got a job working at the local wharves, and he would later base Porgy on the waterfront life he experienced there. Although he wrote poetry and short story for many years, Heyward's main income came from the insurance and real estate company that he co-owned. He didn't start writing full-time until he published Porgy when he was 40 years old. He and his wife adapted the novel into the hit Broadway play, and Heyward later collaborated with songwriters George and Ira Gershwin to turn the play into the folk opera Porgy and Bess. For that production, he co-wrote several songs with Ira Gershwin, including Summertime. Because Gershwin is so well known, he often receives sole credit for the lyrics, but according to legendary composer Stephen Sondheim, most of the lyrics in Porgy and Bess were actually written by Heyward. In a 2003 book called Invisible Giants, Sondheim wrote that Heyward's words are sung, but he is unsung. After he wrote Porgy, Heyward wrote several other novels and a children's book, and he also reportedly worked on the screenplay for the 1937 Paul Muni film The Good Earth, although he wasn't credited. Just a few years later, in 1940, Heyward suffered a fatal heart attack. He was just 54 years old. Now, I touched earlier on Dudley Murphy's beginnings, so let's get back to the career of the director. After directing his first short in 1920, he directed several more, including Ballet Mécanique. This 1924 production is considered to be one of the first avant-garde art films. A few years later, in 1929, he wrote and directed the shorts St. Louis Blues and Black and Tan, which I've mentioned previously. Both of these had all-black casts, with St. Louis Blues starring blues singer Bessie Smith in her only big-screen appearance. Murphy went on to direct several full-length films, including Confessions of a Co-Ed, which showed an 18-year-old Bing Crosby singing in one scene. He also contributed dialogue on 2 of the drafts of Dracula in 1931. But what he really had his sights on was The Emperor Jones. In fact, he had first reached out to O'Neill in the mid-1920s about the play. Nothing came of it, but Murphy was determined, and he developed a 4-page treatment a few years later. In the letter he sent to O'Neill, Murphy wrote, "I am so vitally interested in Emperor Jones that it would nearly break my heart if I could not direct it myself. I am so absolutely sure that I can make a great film out of Emperor Jones that I am willing to gamble or risk anything for the privilege of making it." Filming on Emperor Jones began in New York on May 25, 1933, at Paramount's old studio in Astoria, Long Island. Murphy wanted to film in New York because he was against the Hollywood studio system, and he didn't want to be under Hollywood control. For the scenes showing the Chain Gang, a stone quarry in New Rochelle, New York was used, and a strip of sand in Long Beach near the Boardwalk Pavilion Hotel was used for the scene where Brutus arrives on the island. The jungle and swamp scenes, which are coming up shortly, were constructed in the studio, and heaters were placed in the water to make sure that Robeson didn't catch a chill. Originally, 10 days of shooting were planned on the island of Haiti, but the art director convinced the producers that he could create a realistic jungle set on the soundstage, which was a good thing because the producers really didn't have the budget for this on-location shooting. I'll tell you a little bit more about the producers in a minute. To create the jungle scenes, the producers shipped in plants and trees from the Everglades and other parts of Florida, and to give the jungle that moist and muggy look of a swamp, digestive oil was sprayed in the air with an insect sprayer. And according to the Motion Picture Herald, 250 flies, slightly drugged with ether, were released on the set. The entire shoot took 38 days, with a reported budget of $280,000. $7,500 of that went to pay Murphy's salary, and Robeson received $18,000. After The Emperor Jones, Murphy landed a one-picture deal with MGM and earned mixed reviews for the musical The Night is Young, starring Ramon Navarro. MGM wanted to retain Murphy at the same salary, but when he insisted on holding out for a raise, he found himself out of a job. It appeared that things were looking up for him, though, when he joined English actor Leslie Heyward and writer Hugh Walpole to form an independent production company called Associated Artists. They planned to produce 15 movies in 2 years, with Heyward starring in one picture a year. One of the first would be Bonnie Prince Charlie, written by Walpole and directed by Murphy. Unfortunately, this never happened. You see, Heyward was under contract to Warner Brothers, and when studio head Harry Warner found out about these plans, he let Murphy know that Heyward wasn't allowed to make independent features, and he promptly put the smackdown on the entire venture. So Murphy was down, but not out. He next came up with the idea to take currently running Broadway plays and simultaneously produce feature films based on those plays. When the Broadway run ended, the film would be in the can and ready for release. Murphy had previously adapted the 1935 Horace McCoy novel They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, with hopes of taking it to Broadway, and he wanted to make this adaptation the first project for his new idea. For both the stage play and the film, he planned to star actress Miriam Hopkins, with whom, incidentally, Murphy had had a brief affair when he was associate director for her 1931 film 24 Hours. Once again, though, this idea of Murphy's failed to get off the ground. In 1941, with these failed ventures behind him, Murphy directed 7 shorts known as soundies, which were 3-minute musical films that are considered to be the precursors to today's music videos. 3 of these films starred Dorothy Dandridge, 13 years before she'd be nominated for the Best Actress Academy Award for Carmen Jones. Murphy next directed 2 feature films in Mexico, but this would be his last time behind the camera. In a complete about-face, he opened a resort hotel in Malibu in 1949 called Dudley Murphy's Holiday House. In an issue of an architecture magazine that came out that year, Holiday House was described as swankily furnished, and by the early 1950s, Murphy had turned it into a successful spot that attracted celebrities including Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner, Marilyn Monroe, Gary Cooper, and Elizabeth Taylor. He continued to operate Holiday House until the 1960s, when his health began to fail and he sold the property. He died in 1968 at the age of 70. Now, let's talk a little about how The Emperor Jones actually came to be. The financing for the film came from John Kremsky and Gifford Alexander Cochran, but their involvement as producers was really more luck than anything else. Cochran came from a wealthy, socially prominent family, graduated from Yale, and went to art school in Munich. Kremsky was an advertising and PR exec. His career in the theater started in the late 1920s when he founded New York's first Play of the Month Club, where members were given access to the best seats at New York plays. In 1931, Kremsky and Cochran met by chance in Paris, where they both were attending a screening of the German film Mädchen in Uniform. This groundbreaking movie was about a girl who falls in love with her boarding school teacher. Kremsky and Cochran teamed up to bring the film to the U.S., and it was a hit with both critics and audiences. Kremsky and Cochran paid $8,000 for the American distribution rights and ended up grossing $400,000. After this success, they were on the lookout for another motion picture project. Meanwhile, Dudley Murphy, if you recall, had sent his 4-page treatment to Eugene O'Neill for consideration. O'Neill agreed to a 60-day option, and a couple of days later, Murphy had lunch at New York's Algonquin Hotel, whose owner, Frank Case, knew about Murphy's interest in The Emperor Jones. Case introduced Murphy to John Kremsky, and before you could say Bob's your uncle, Krimsky and Cochran bought the option on the film and paid O'Neill $30,000 for the rights. There were only two conditions attached. O'Neill insisted that Paul Robeson play the title role, and Robeson requested that no filming take place south of the Mason-Dixon line. Back on screen, we've now reached the part of the film that's set entirely in the jungle, and as you saw a few seconds ago, when Brutus entered the jungle, the screen switched to a blue tint. Along with the double exposures that you'll see shortly, the tint was used to amplify the fear and panic of Brutus's experience. Incidentally, this is Kodak tint number 10, Azure, which was described in the Eastman Kodak catalog as being suggestive of the sedate and reserved, even approaching the austere or forbidding, and under certain conditions, slightly gloomy. Over time, the tint was removed from most of the prints of the film, but it was restored by the Library of Congress, and it clearly adds to the unreal, otherworldly atmosphere in this entire scene. And speaking of the otherworldly atmosphere, a great deal of this comes courtesy of Ernest Haller, who had an impressive career as a cinematographer and was Oscar nominated for numerous films, including Jezebel, Mildred Pierce, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and Lilies of the Field. And he won the Academy Award for his first color film, Gone with the Wind. Haller earned $300 a week for his work on The Emperor Jones. He actually started out as an actor with Biograph Studios in 1914, but it didn't take long for him to discover that his real interest was behind the camera, and his first job was assistant to the cameraman for director D.W. Griffith. By the time the talkies came along in the late 1920s, Haller had photographed close to 50 movies. He was notable for being Betty Davis's favorite cameraman, and he worked with her on 14 films, starting with The Rich Are Always With Us in 1932. Davis called Haller a genius and her miracle man, and in an interview with author Whitney Stein, she said that Haller was, quote, a quiet, very low-key individual personality-wise, but God, he knew what he was doing. After 6 decades in the motion picture industry, Haller announced his retirement in 1965. But the following year, he was convinced by director James Goldstone to photograph the second pilot of TV's Star Trek series called Where No Man Has Gone Before. This episode would be Haller's last credit. Now, a little earlier, I talked about the cuts to the film regarding the N-word, but let's look at some other changes that were made. First off, all of the scenes with Freddie Washington had to be reshot after the film was reviewed by the Hays office. This is because the Hays office was concerned that due to Freddie's light skin, audiences might think that Brutus Jones was carrying on with a white woman, and the Hays Code specifically prohibited the depiction of sexual relationships between blacks and whites. As a result, Freddie's face was darkened, making it look completely unnatural in my opinion, and her scenes were shot again. If you look closely at these scenes, you can see that her arms, back, and legs are not always the same shade as her face. Also, you'll remember that a few minutes ago I pointed out the scene where Smithers lights Brutus's cigarettes. In many markets, this scene was cut from the movie because of the submissiveness that was suggested by this act. Also, just before Brutus escapes from the chain gang, there's the scene where he kills the white prison guard. The shot of Brutus actually striking the guard with a shovel was cut because a violent act of a black person against a white person could not be shown. So in one moment, you saw Brutus raise the shovel, and in the next, the guard was lying on the ground dead. Another major cut to the film concerns a scene in the jungle. As written in the play, one of Brutus's hallucinations involves him being brought to America on a slave ship and sold at auction, but this scene was completely cut from the released film. When the Library of Congress conducted its restoration of the movie, they were unable to locate the deleted footage of Brutus striking the guard or the scenes involving the slave ship and the slave auction, so you don't see these. By the way, as part of its restoration effort, the Library of Congress located footage at the Museum of Modern Art, the National Archives of Canada, and in the possessions of a film collector who had died in 1987. And the film's soundtrack, which was also missing, was recovered from a Vitaphone disc that was in another private collection. It's interesting to note that there was much consideration given by the Hays office to the use of the words Lord and God in the film, which Brutus uses especially during his experience in the jungle. This is due to the section in the Motion Picture Production Code that prohibits what it calls pointed profanity, which includes the words Lord and God unless they're used reverently. This matter was carefully reviewed by Vincent Hart of the Hays office, who also conferred with the chairman of the censorship boards in New York and Pennsylvania. In a June 1933 letter to John Kremski, Hart announced his decision that the words were not objectionable and could remain in the film because their use was, quote, characteristic of the Negro in moments of deep emotion and supplication and not in a profane manner. In addition to the Hays office, individual state censorship boards also had the ability to weigh in on the film. Many approved the film without any cuts, like the boards from New York, Kansas, and Massachusetts, but there were some boards that had very specific objections. The board in Ontario, Canada, for instance, had numerous requests for deletions. One was a view of Undine sitting with Brutus, where she raises her skirt and tucks money into her garter. The board also wanted to eliminate any shots that showed the knife in the fight between Brutus and Jeff, and the scene early on when Brutus hands that wad of money to Dolly. And there were several lines that the Ontario board wanted cut as well, including the scene with Undine where Brutus tells her, "You're too funny to live with." The board also wanted to cut the line where Brutus tells Undine, "Here's $40 and goodbye," and two lines delivered by Smithers, one where he says, "Here's $5 silver for Brutus," and another where he says, "He belongs to me." Now, as we approach the film's climax, let's talk a little bit about William DeMille, who some sources identify as production supervisor, some as the script supervisor, and some as the film's uncredited co-director. DeMille, by the way, was the older brother of director Cecil B. DeMille, who gave us both the 1923 and 1956 versions of the Ten Commandments, as well as numerous other classics. William DeMille was also the father of dancer and choreographer Agnes DeMille. William DeMille graduated from the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in 1901. That same year, he wrote and produced his first one-act play called A Mixed Foursome, and both he and his brother Cecil performed in it. He went on to write several plays and vaudeville skits and then moved to Hollywood to work with his brother for the Jesse Lasky Feature Play Company, which would eventually become Paramount Studios. He would later direct more than 50 films, as well as do some writing and producing for the movies. He was the second president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and he hosted the second Oscar ceremony in 1930. In the beginning of The Emperor Jones, DeMille's name is shown with a supervised by credit. But what exactly does this mean? In a 1974 interview with Robeson biographer Andrew Buney, producer Kremski shed a little light on this when he said Paul Robeson was unhappy with the direction he received from Murphy. He had complained that Murphy was condescending toward him and rushed him through certain scenes. As a result, Kremski said, DeMille was brought on the production to work with Robeson on his lines, especially during the jungle scene. But DeMille claimed to be much more important to the film than this. Dudley Murphy's biographer, Susan Delson, cites a letter that DeMille wrote to his daughter Agnes, where he criticized Murphy's direction and Kremski's producing abilities, and stated that he not only directed the jungle scenes, but also recut the film. In part, DeMille wrote, "When we hit the O'Neill part of the picture, things were going so badly that they fired Murphy, who wouldn't be guided by me, and asked me to shoot the picture myself. I reluctantly consented. Then Murphy wept and wailed and said if they'd let him stay on as director, I could take absolute charge and he'd obey orders." It's important to note here that Delson, along with other film scholars, disputes this version of events. In her book, she writes, quote, "It's unlikely that DeMille, at the sputtering end of a lengthy career, was granted the kind of carte blanche that he described." Also, speaking of recutting the film, I'd like to mention that the film's actual editor was Grant Whitelock, who started his career during the silent era on films like The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, starring Rudolph Valentino, and The Prisoner of Zenda, both directed by Irish film director Rex Ingram, not to be confused with the actor who plays the court crier in Emperor Jones. Whitelock would go on to edit The Count of Monte Cristo, The Man in the Iron Mask, and one of my favorite film noir features, New York Confidential. In the 1960s, Whitelock joined producer Edward Small to form Admiral Pictures and produced several films, including 2 Vincent Price movies. He was also the uncle of actress Mary Carlisle. The Emperor Jones opened in New York on September 19, 1933, and there were 2 premieres in Manhattan. One was uptown at the Roosevelt Theater in Harlem, and one was in Midtown at the Rivoli. The Harlem premiere attracted celebrities including dancer Bill Robinson and boxer Jack Johnson, and guests at the Midtown premiere included family members of former President Teddy Roosevelt. The film made back most of the money that the producers put up for the budget, but overall it was not a great financial success. It did brisk business in cities like New York and Washington, D.C., but the box office receipts in the South and in non-urban areas were a different story. Variety had predicted that the film would have a problem in medium and smaller-sized cities where the subject of the film was, quote, not regulation screen fare. Likewise, Harrison's Reports, a trade journal based in New York, informed its readers that the film wasn't suitable for children, adolescents, or for Sundays, and that few exhibitors in the southern states can show it. And Murphy blamed the distributor, United Artists, for poorly promoting the film and failing to keep it in theaters long enough for word of mouth to result in a boost in business. Still, the marketing team for United Artists definitely came up with some fun and unique ideas to promote the movie. The team let exhibitors know that their promotion efforts should be every bit as startling as the theme of the picture. Don't sell Emperor Jones as you would an ordinary production, they were told. One of the ideas was to have proclamations printed up to look like the ones posted in the movie when the Emperor Jones raised the taxes. The proclamations could be posted in the busiest sections of the cities where the film was playing, and the text would say, Emperor Jones is coming to take over the town and rule with an iron hand. Another idea was to have a display in theater lobbies where moviegoers could roll dice down an incline and try their luck at guessing how the dice would fall. The tagline for the display would read, Emperor Jones takes all the gamble out of picking a screen winner. Exhibitors were also encouraged to record the sound effect of the tom-tom drums that were heard during the jungle scene and constantly project the sound through a loudspeaker in the theater. And there was a lot of promotional language and clever taglines that exhibitors could use in print advertising. One was, your heart will beat a tom-tom tattoo as you thrill to this tense drama of the Pullman porter who would be king. And another was, Emperor Jones, he conquered strong men, broke women's hearts, smashed nations' laws, but he overplays his hand and finds no more aces in his deck of magic cards. But my favorite is this one. Rhythm of spirituals, of clicking Pullman wheels, of throbbing jazz in gaudy Harlem flats. Rhythm of dice, of gin, of the chain gang. Yeah, man. Rhythm of an emperor's court, to which he rose in style, and the rhythm of the voodoo drums which sends him tumbling to his doom. And I'd say that just about covers it all. So now as we come to the end of the film and prepare to watch Brutus meet his inescapable downfall, I'd like to thank you so much for listening to my commentary on the Emperor Jones. Despite its problematic language and its often problematic situations, there's no denying that The Emperor Jones is an important piece of filmmaking created by a uniquely talented cast and crew. One of the movie's many champions when it was released was the critic from the Brooklyn Eagle, who said that the film was a genuine work of art. He wrote that Robeson was superb in a part that was made to his order, that Diggs gave a magnificent performance, and that Murphy directed the film with skill. The overall production, he said, was something the movies have reason to be proud of. And I'll second that. And on that note, I'll let Smithers take us out with the last words.
So they did for you right enough, Jonesy, my lad. Dead as a herring. Where's all your high and mighty airs now, your blooming majesty? silver bullets. Blimey. Anyhow, you died in the height of style.
This is Karen Burroughs Hannsberry saying so long, and I'll catch you on the flip side.